The evening sun was casting long shadows across the playground, the laughter and chatter of children filling the cool autumn air. Julia, a bright-eyed little girl with curly hair and a wide toothy grin, ran from the swings to the slide, lost in her world of fun and games. Her mother, Alicia, sat on a nearby bench, keeping an eye on her daughter while chatting with another parent. As the evening wore on, families began to head home, and the playground grew quieter. Julia had just one more slide before she'd be ready to go, or so she promised. As Alicia looked down to check her phone, she noticed a tall figure out of the corner of her eye, an officer dressed in uniform, his face partially shadowed by his hat, standing close to the playground entrance. She hadn't noticed him earlier. He was looking directly at Julia. A chill ran down Alicia's spine, but she shook it off, chalking it up to her protective instincts. But then, without warning, the officer walked briskly toward the slide where Julia was standing. Alicia watched in horror as he reached out, grasped Julia's hand, and firmly pulled her toward him. Julia's joyful laugh faded into confusion and fear as she struggled against the officer's grip. Alicia leapt up from the bench, her voice sharp and panicked, yelling, "Hey! What are you doing? That's my daughter." The officer turned, his expression cold and unyielding. "Step back. I have orders." "Orders? What are you talking about?" Alicia shouted, her voice breaking. She couldn't believe what was happening. This was her neighborhood, a place she'd always felt safe, and here was an officer taking her child with no explanation. "Stay back," the officer warned again, reaching for his radio. Alicia felt her heart race, her palms sweating as she took a hesitant step forward. Her instinct to protect Julia took over her sense of caution. She could see the fear in her daughter's eyes, and she wouldn't let this man take her without a fight. Just as Alicia took another step forward, the officer's grip tightened on Julia. He pulled her toward a patrol car parked nearby, practically dragging her along as she stumbled, her tiny feet unable to keep up. "Let her go!" Alicia screamed, rushing forward, but another officer appeared, blocking her path. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but by now the playground was nearly empty. Julia's cries pierced the air, mingling with the sound of Alicia's desperate pleas. In one swift motion, the officer lifted Julia into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door shut. Alicia watched in helpless horror as the car sped away, the sound of its engine fading as quickly as her hope. That night was a blur. Alicia spent hours at the police station, demanding answers, but none came. The officers at the station shrugged off her concerns, telling her that no officer was dispatched to the playground that day. Desperation clawed at her as she realized that something far more sinister was at play. Then came the dawn of the next day, a day filled with unbearable silence. Alicia barely slept, her mind racing with fear and anger. By morning, the news of Julia's disappearance had spread, the neighborhood buzzing with whispers and speculation. Friends and family came by to support her, each of them just as desperate to understand how such a thing could happen. But just as Alicia's sorrow began to sink into despair, something shifted. Morning sunlight streamed through Alicia's living room, casting pale shadows that only emphasized the emptiness in the house. She sat on the couch, clutching a photograph of Julia, her mind running in circles trying to piece together what had happened. Every detail of the previous night replayed in her head, the chilling, blank face of that officer, the muffled cries of her daughter, and the feeling of helplessness as she watched the patrol car disappear down the street. As she sat there, a sudden knock at the door broke through her thoughts. Her heart leaped with hope, and she rushed to open it, but it was only her brother, Daniel. He had driven through the night after hearing the news, his eyes darkened with worry. "Have you heard anything?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Alicia shook her head, barely holding back tears. "The police aren't telling me anything. They keep saying no officer was sent to the playground, but I know what I saw." Her voice trembled, but there was an edge of determination in it. Daniel took a deep breath, glancing around the room as if searching for answers in the silence. "This doesn't feel right, Alicia. This isn't just some random kidnapping. Something else is going on." Alicia's phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she snatched it up, hoping for news, but it was only a message from a friend offering support and telling her to stay strong. She dropped the phone back onto the table, feeling her anger rise. Why wasn't anyone taking her seriously? Why was the police department acting like her daughter had just vanished into thin air? Daniel said, his voice suddenly resolute, "I can't sit around and do nothing. If the police won't help, we need to find her ourselves." He nodded understandingly at the fire in her eyes. Together, they grabbed their coats and headed out to the playground, hoping to find anything that might give them a clue. The swings creaked in the gentle morning breeze, and the playground, usually filled with laughter, felt eerily silent. As they walked around, Alicia noticed a set of fresh tire tracks near the slide, ones that seemed out of place. She knelt down, examining them closely. "These are from last night," she murmured. Daniel joined her, nodding in agreement. "This has to be where he parked," he said, his tone dark. "The car didn't have police markings, right?" Alicia shook her head. "No, it looked like a regular patrol car, but something about it was off." She swallowed hard, feeling a knot of fear in her stomach. They spent hours searching, questioning anyone who'd been around the park, hoping someone had seen something, but all they got were sympathetic glances and vague descriptions. Frustration knotted Alicia's heart, but she refused to give up. If there was one thing she knew, it was that she would do whatever it took to bring her daughter back. As evening crept in, they returned to Alicia's house, exhausted but resolute. Daniel sat down with his laptop, determined to dig through any news or police reports that might give them a lead. Alicia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the screen, but their search yielded nothing useful. Just as they were about to call it a night, Daniel's screen pinged with a notification. It was a small news article from a few months back, talking about a local officer who'd been suspended from duty after accusations of misconduct. The article didn't name him directly, but included enough information to hint at someone with a history of crossing the line. Alicia felt her breath catch. Could this be connected? She scribbled down the officer's description, committing every detail to memory: a tall man in his mid-40s with a reputation for being aggressive, particularly with families of color. The more she read, the clearer it became that this officer had a dark side. Her instincts told her this was no coincidence. Alicia turned to Daniel, her face set with determination. "I think I know who took her. This officer, he's dangerous. He's done this before. We need to find out where he lives." Daniel nodded grimly. "Then let's get moving." The night was dark as they climbed into the car, their determination driving them against the shadows outside. They navigated the narrow streets, following the address they'd found online, a rundown house on the edge of town. Alicia's heart raced as they pulled up, watching the dim light flickering inside the house. This was it, she could feel it. Daniel glanced at her, his expression tense. "Stay here." Alicia replied, "Let me handle this." But Alicia shook her head. "No, this is my daughter. I'm going in with you." Alicia's hands were trembling as she and Daniel stepped out of the car, facing the officer's rundown house. Shadows stretched across the yard, making the place look even more sinister. The only light came from a dim bulb flickering on the porch, casting eerie shapes on the worn wooden walls. Alicia felt a chill, but her determination to find Julia kept her moving forward. Daniel motioned for her to stay close as they crept up to the window, peering inside. The living room was a mess, empty beer cans and crumpled papers littered the floor, and the place smelled like a mix of stale cigarettes and mold. The officer was sitting on the couch watching the news, oblivious to their presence. Alicia clenched her fists, her anger bubbling up, but Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, reminding her to stay calm. Just then, the officer's phone rang. Alicia and Daniel leaned closer, straining to hear as he answered. "Yeah, don't worry about it. Everything's under control," the officer said, his voice cold. "No one's going to find her? I made sure of that." Alicia's stomach twisted. She fought the urge to barge right then, but Daniel tightened his grip on her arm, silently telling her to hold back. They needed more information before they acted. As the officer hung up, he stood and headed toward the back of the house. Daniel nodded, and they circled around to another window, watching as he disappeared into what looked like a basement door. The thought of Julia locked up down there made Alicia's blood boil. "We can't wait any longer. We have to get in there," she whispered to Daniel, her voice filled with urgency. He nodded, pulling a flashlight from his pocket. "We need to be quiet. The last thing we need is him catching us off guard." They crept around to the side door, hoping it would be unlocked. To their relief, it opened with a faint creak, and they slipped inside, closing it softly behind them. The hallway was dark, the air thick and musty, and each step echoed faintly off the walls. Every sound made Alicia's heart race faster. She was terrified, but the thought of Julia kept her moving. They made their way toward the basement door, holding their breath as they listened for any sign of the officer. When they were sure he was still downstairs, Daniel slowly opened the door, and they carefully descended the creaky steps, moving as quietly as possible. Each step seemed to go on forever, the darkness pressing in around them. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a dimly lit basement filled with the smell of damp concrete and old metal boxes. Dusty tools were scattered everywhere, casting long shadows in the dim light. Daniel motioned for Alicia to stay close as they moved deeper into the room, their eyes scanning every corner. Suddenly, a faint noise caught Alicia's attention, a soft, muffled whimper. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked at Daniel, who nodded, his face tense. They followed the sound to a door at the back of the room, locked with a heavy chain. Without hesitation, Daniel pulled out a small toolkit he always carried, working quickly to pick the lock. The seconds stretched with every tiny click of the lock echoing in the silence. Alicia's anxiety grew with each passing moment, the fear of being caught gnawing at her nerves. Finally, with a soft click, the lock came undone, and Daniel slowly opened the door. Inside was a small, dark room, and there huddled in the corner was Julia. Her eyes were wide with fear, but the moment she saw her mother, relief flooded her face, and she let out a shaky cry. Alicia rushed forward, scooping her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. "Mama," Julia whispered, clinging to her with all her strength. Alicia stroked her daughter's hair, whispering soothing words, trying to calm her down. "We're here, baby. We're taking you home," she murmured, her voice barely holding back tears. But their relief was short-lived. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed down the basement stairs. The officer was returning. Daniel looked at Alicia, his eyes sharp with urgency. "We need to hide now." They darted into the shadows, pulling Julia close as they pressed themselves against the cold, damp wall, holding their breath. The officer stepped into the basement, his eyes scanning the room. He was muttering under his breath, frustration evident in his every move. Alicia's heart pounded as she watched him move around the room, searching for any sign of disturbance. She held Julia close, praying that he wouldn't notice the unlocked door. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. Just as he turned his back, Daniel made a silent signal, and they slipped out of the room, moving as quietly as possible. They reached the stairs and climbed quickly, stifling every sound. They couldn't afford to make a single noise that might give them away. Once they reached the top, they darted for the side door, slipping out into the cool night air. The house loomed behind them, dark and menacing, but they didn't dare look back. Alicia held Julia tightly as they sprinted to the car, Daniel right behind them. The adrenaline fueled them, pushing them forward. As they reached the car and climbed inside, Alicia turned to Julia, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now, sweetheart. I'm here." But as they pulled away, a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway of the house, watching them with a furious glare. The officer knew they had escaped, and from the look in his eyes, he wasn't done yet. As they sped down the empty road, Alicia looked over at Julia, who was curled up in the back seat, her little face pale and frightened. Alicia reached back, brushing her daughter's cheek gently. Julia was safe, but the ordeal had clearly shaken her to the core. Alicia turned to Daniel, who was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "We need to lay low," Daniel said, his voice tense. "He knows we were there, and if he's desperate enough, he won't just let this go. Alicia nodded, still reeling from everything they'd been through. They'd gotten Julia back, but the fear lingered. The officer's face, dark, furious, and menacing, was burned into her memory, a constant reminder that their troubles were far from over. They turned onto a winding dirt road leading to Daniel's family cabin, nestled deep within the woods. It was isolated, the perfect place to regroup and figure out their next steps. As they pulled up, Alicia glanced around, noting the thick cover of trees and the quiet that enveloped them. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, the sense of safety settling in inside the cabin. Daniel quickly secured the doors and windows, making sure every possible entry point was locked tight. Alicia sat down with Julia, her heart aching as she held her close, feeling the weight of everything settle upon her. She tried to comfort her daughter, whispering words of reassurance, but deep down, the fear lingered. "Mama, is he going to come for us?" Julia's small voice broke through the silence, her wide eyes filled with worry. Alicia hugged her tightly. "No, baby. He can't hurt us anymore." Daniel returned from securing the cabin, his face set in a grim expression. "We'll be safe here for now," he said, his voice low. "But I think we need to call in some backup." Alicia nodded, her mind racing. They needed allies, someone who could help them stand against the officer's abuse of power. Daniel pulled out his phone, dialing a number. As he stepped outside to make the call, Alicia could see his silhouette through the window, his hand gesturing as he spoke, the tension evident in his movements. Just as Daniel finished the call, a loud crack rang out, echoing through the quiet forest. Alicia's heart leaped into her throat as she looked at Daniel, who was standing frozen, his eyes wide with shock. She realized instantly what had happened, a gunshot. "Get down," she whispered urgently to Julia, pulling her to the floor. As she crawled toward the window, her hands shook as she peered outside, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the dark, she could make out the faint glint of a vehicle parked a little way down the road, barely visible through the trees. It was unmistakable, the officer had tracked them down. He was here, lurking just outside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Daniel rushed back inside, slamming the door behind him. "He's here," he hissed, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to be ready." They moved quickly, barricading the doors and windows, grabbing anything they could find to reinforce their defenses. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the cabin settling making Alicia jump. Her nerves were stretched thin, she could feel Julia trembling beside her. She whispered reassurances, trying to keep her daughter calm. Then another shot rang out, this one hitting the cabin wall, splintering wood and sending bits of debris flying. Alicia ducked, covering Julia with her body, shielding her from the impact. Daniel darted to the window, peering out cautiously. "He's trying to scare us," Daniel muttered, his jaw clenched. "But we're not going down without a fight." He grabbed an old hunting rifle that had been hanging above the fireplace, loading it with quick, practiced movements. Alicia watched him, her heart pounding as the reality of their situation set in. They were trapped alone in the woods with a man determined to silence them. The night wore on, the tension unrelenting as the officer circled the cabin, firing sporadically. Each shot was a reminder of the danger that loomed. Daniel returned fire when he could, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the trees, breaking the silence of the night. Alicia held Julia close, whispering comforting words as she tried to shield her daughter from the fear that gripped her own heart. Finally, after what felt like hours, the gunfire stopped. The silence was almost more unnerving than the noise, and Alicia held her breath, listening intently for any sign of movement. Then a shadow passed by the window, and she realized with a sinking feeling that the officer was trying to find a way inside. Daniel caught her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. They couldn't let him break through, not when they were so close to safety. They moved to the center of the cabin, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the windows. Daniel kept the rifle trained on the door, his finger hovering over the trigger, ready for whatever might come next. Alicia wrapped her arms around Julia, feeling her daughter's small body trembling against her own. In the silence, they heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching the door, slow and deliberate, each step sending a shiver down Alicia's spine. Her grip tightened, her heart pounding as she prepared for the inevitable. With a sudden crash, the door splintered open, and the officer stepped inside, his eyes filled with twisted satisfaction. He took a step forward, his gun trained on Daniel, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could hide from me," he sneered, his voice low and mocking. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Daniel raised his rifle, his gaze steady. "You're the one who doesn't know who you're dealing with," he replied, his voice unwavering. For a tense moment, they stood facing each other, the room thick with anticipation. Alicia held Julia close, her heart racing as she waited, hoping and praying that they would make it out of this alive. The room felt like it was holding its breath, every heartbeat, every tense glance between Daniel and the officer seemed to stretch time itself. Alicia could barely breathe, her arms tied around Julia, who clung to her mother with wide, fearful eyes. The officer took another step forward, his gaze cold and unwavering. While Daniel held his rifle steady, his finger resting on the trigger, the standoff was electric, each man daring the other to make the first move. "What do you even want?" Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. The officer sneered, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Justice," he spat, his voice filled with bitterness. "People like you don't get to walk away from this." He aimed his gun, but Daniel didn't flinch. The tension mounted, thick and suffocating, as they stared each other down. Alicia's pulse hammered in her ears, her mind racing for any possible escape. Her eyes darted to the broken door, calculating the odds of slipping past, but the officer's sharp gaze was focused on every movement. Without warning, the officer lunged forward, swinging his weapon toward Daniel. Reacting instinctively, Daniel ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and swung his rifle to counter. They struggled, grappling for control, their faces set in fierce determination as each fought to gain the upper hand. Alicia seized the opportunity, whispering urgently to Julia, "Stay low and follow me." They crawled toward the corner, staying out of sight as much as possible. Her heart thundered with fear, but she forced herself to keep moving, determined to protect her daughter. The sounds of their struggle filled the cabin, heavy breathing, grunts of exertion, the scrape of boots against the floor. The officer was strong, fueled by unrelenting rage, but Daniel held his ground, refusing to let this man tear his family apart. They grappled, their movements intense and desperate, each trying to overpower the other. A loud bang echoed through the cabin as the officer managed to fire a shot into the ceiling, causing a shower of plaster and wood splinters to rain down on them. The distraction gave Daniel the opening he needed. He surged forward, knocking the officer back, disarming him in one swift movement. The officer stumbled, his face twisted with rage as he lunged again, this time with empty hands, but just as dangerous. Meanwhile, Alicia had reached the far corner of the cabin with Julia. She frantically scanned the room, looking for anything that could help them defend themselves. Her eyes landed on a heavy iron fire poker by the fireplace, and without a second thought, she grabbed it, holding it tightly. The officer was relentless, his attacks growing more desperate as Daniel fought back. Daniel managed to knock the officer down, pinning him to the floor, but the officer twisted, breaking free, and scrambled back to his feet. He turned to face Alicia, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her holding the fire poker. "Think you're brave," he sneered, taking a step toward her, his voice dripping with contempt as if he relished every ounce of fear he saw in her eyes. Alicia didn't hesitate. She tightened her grip on the poker, her hand shaking but her resolve firm. "Stay away from my family," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. The officer laughed, but the sound was hollow, almost deranged. He took another step toward her, but before he could close the distance, Daniel tackled him from behind, slamming him against the wall. The impact rattled the cabin, and for a moment, the officer was dazed, giving Alicia the chance to back up, putting more space between him and her daughter. Then, unexpectedly, the officer drew a hidden knife from his boot, slashing toward Daniel with a vicious swing. The blade narrowly missed, slicing through Daniel's shirt as he dodged, but it was enough to put him on the defensive, forcing him to backpedal as the officer advanced, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and satisfaction. Alicia's heart pounded as she watched, her mind racing. She glanced at Julia, her daughter's terrified eyes locked on her mother's face, seeking reassurance. Alicia offered her a quick, shaky smile, trying to convey strength despite the terror gnawing at her. Daniel stepped another lunge, then brought his rifle up, using it to block the knife's downward arc. The two struggled, locked in a tense back and forth, each movement fast and brutal. The officer's face was twisted with fury, his breath ragged as he fought with relentless determination. Suddenly, a noise from outside the cabin caught everyone's attention, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. The officer faltered, his head snapping toward the sound. Alicia felt a spark of hope flare within her, wondering if help had arrived, but the look of dread on the officer's face told her that whoever was outside wasn't a welcome ally. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried, as if whoever was approaching knew exactly what awaited them inside. The officer's face paled, and his grip on the knife tightened as he glanced around, realizing that he might be outnumbered. Daniel seized the moment, delivering a powerful blow that knocked the knife from the officer's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. The officer stumbled back, his gaze darting between the broken door and the approaching footsteps. He looked desperate, trapped like a cornered animal. Alicia held her breath, watching as the officer made a snap decision. In an instant, he turned and bolted toward the broken door, abandoning his weapon as he scrambled to escape. He burst outside, disappearing into the dark night as the sound of the footsteps drew closer. For a few moments, there was only silence. Daniel lowered his rifle, breathing heavily as he glanced at Alicia, relief evident in his eyes. But their reprieve was short-lived, the footsteps had stopped right outside the cabin. The door creaked as it slowly swung open, and Alicia's heart skipped a beat as she waited, her body tense with anticipation. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight, their presence radiating a calm yet powerful aura. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle, but the figure held up a hand, signaling peace. "I'm here to help," they said, their voice low and steady. There was a firmness in their tone, a quiet strength that offered a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. Alicia exchanged a glance with Daniel, unsure of what to make of this new arrival. They'd fought so hard, endured so much, and now someone else had entered their lives, someone who might be able to change the course of everything. The stranger's presence filled the cabin with a calm tension, an odd contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Alicia glanced between Daniel and the newcomer, her mind racing with questions, her body still tense from the recent fight. The man took a slow step forward, his face partially visible in the dim light. He was tall and built, his features hidden beneath a dark cap, and his demeanor gave the impression of someone who moved with purpose. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Alicia, then on Julia, and finally on Daniel. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but resolute, "for now, at least." Daniel lowered his rifle slightly, but his stance was still guarded. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "And how did you find us?" The man didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and Alicia's heart leaped, fearing he was reaching for a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small silver badge, holding it up just long enough for them to see before tucking it back away. "I'm with an organization that watches out for situations like these," he replied, his tone steady but firm. "We know who that officer was, and we know what he's capable of." Alicia's stomach twisted at the mention of the officer, her thoughts flashing back to the terror she'd felt, the way he'd looked at her family with pure malice. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at her, a flicker of something almost sympathetic in his eyes. "He's part of a network, people who think they're above the law, who abuse their power to terrorize innocent families." His gaze hardened. "But we've been watching him, waiting." A chill ran down Alicia's spine. She held Julia close, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily in the room. It was terrifying and a relief all at once to know they weren't alone in facing this nightmare. Daniel nodded slowly, his grip loosening just slightly on the rifle. "Why now? Why show up here right after he—" He broke off as the stranger interrupted. "The network thrives in secrecy, but he's gone too far, too openly. His actions could expose all of them." They'll want to silence anyone who knows too much. The weight of his words settled heavily over them. Alicia's mind reeled at the realization that the danger they faced was even greater than she'd imagined. They weren't just up against a single rogue officer, they were up against an organized network, a hidden threat that reached deeper than she could comprehend. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The man's gaze shifted to the broken door, his expression tense. "You have to leave this place tonight." He paused, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to appear at any moment. "They'll send others, and they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes." Alicia felt her breath catch. The thought of uprooting their lives, of leaving behind everything they knew, was daunting, but the urgency in the man's voice left no room for doubt. Daniel nodded, his jaw set in determination. "If we leave, will they follow us?" "They might," the man replied honestly. "But I can help you. There's a safe location where families like yours can stay hidden, off the grid. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll buy you time to figure out your next steps." A flicker of hope ignited in Alicia's heart. It wasn't an ideal situation, but if it meant keeping her family safe, she was willing to do whatever it took. She glanced at Daniel, seeing the same resolve in his eyes. "What do we need to do?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with determination. The man pulled out a small folded piece of paper, handing it to him. "This is the address. It's about a 3-hour drive from here. Head west and avoid the main roads. Once you get there, someone will meet you, someone you can trust." Alicia took a shaky breath, glancing at Julia, who was clinging to her tightly, her eyes wide and fearful. She gave her daughter a reassuring smile, hoping to ease her worry even as her own heart raced with uncertainty. The man moved toward the door, casting one last glance at the family before he left. "Pack only what you need, leave no trace behind, and remember, trust no one, not until you get to the safe house." With that, he slipped out of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he'd arrived. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of his warning and the looming danger that awaited them. Daniel turned to Alicia, his eyes filled with determination. "We have to go now. Pack whatever we can carry, and we'll leave in 10 minutes. Alicia nodded, moving quickly to gather their essentials. She grabbed a small bag, filling it with clothes, water, and whatever food they had left. Her hands trembled as she worked, her mind racing with 1,000 fears and uncertainties, but she forced herself to focus. She had to be strong. For Julia, for Daniel, for their family. Daniel loaded the rifle and checked his handgun, making sure they were ready in case they encountered any threats on the road. He was focused, his mind clear and unwavering despite the storm of emotions churning within him. As they prepared to leave, Alicia took one last look around the cabin, the place that had been their refuge, their sanctuary in a world that seemed increasingly dangerous. It felt surreal to leave it all behind, to abandon everything they'd worked for in search of safety. With a heavy heart, she took Julia's hand, leading her out to the car where Daniel was waiting. They loaded their bags, securing everything tightly, and climbed into the vehicle. The engine rumbled to life, a sound that seemed both comforting and ominous in the stillness of the night. As they pulled away from the cabin, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding as the cabin disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the night. They drove in silence, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on them. The roads were empty, the landscape dark and foreboding, as if the world itself had turned against them. Alicia clung to Julia, feeling the warmth of her daughter's small hand in hers, a fragile comfort in the face of the unknown. Hours passed in intense silence, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. They followed the directions the stranger had given, avoiding the main roads and taking hidden routes that wound through the wilderness. Every shadow, every distant light seemed to hold a hidden threat, keeping them on edge as they drove deeper into the night. Finally, as dawn began to break on the horizon, they reached their destination, a small, unassuming house nestled among the trees, hidden from prying eyes. It looked quiet and peaceful, even, but Alicia's heart raced with anticipation, her mind filled with questions about what awaited them here. As they parked, a figure emerged from the shadows, a familiar face that sent a surge of relief through Alicia's heart. The stranger was here, waiting just as he had promised. He gave them a nod, his expression calm but resolute as he approached the car. "You made it," he said, his voice filled with quiet approval. "You're safe now, for the moment." As dawn's first light filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on the secluded house, a sense of both calm and tension settled over the group. Alicia, Daniel, and Julia stepped out of the car, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and wary expressions. The stranger, whose name they still didn't know, ushered them toward the small house, his gaze sweeping the surroundings for any sign of danger. The silence was thick, filled only with the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path leading to the front door. Alicia kept a firm grip on Julia's hand, her eye scanning the trees, half expecting shadows to leap out at them at any moment. Daniel walked beside her, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his hip, his every sense on high alert. The stranger opened the door and motioned them inside. The interior of the house was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture and basic supplies. It looked like a place meant for quick stays and quiet exits, not for long-term living. Alicia couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her as she took in the surroundings. Once they were inside, the stranger closed the door, securing several locks and sliding a heavy bar across it. "This place is safe, at least for now," he said, his tone low and serious. "But it won't be long before they realize where you are. We need to be prepared." Alicia nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She glanced at Daniel, who was already scanning the room for any sign of weapons or escape routes. They'd come so far, survived so much, she wasn't about to let her guard down now. "Who exactly are we up against?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. The stranger looked at him with a grim expression. "They're powerful, people who operate outside the law, who believe they're untouchable. They've built a network that spans far beyond what you've seen so far." Alicia felt a shiver run down her spine. She'd known that danger was real, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it all the more terrifying. She tightened her grip on Julia, who was clinging to her side, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. The stranger turned to Alicia, his gaze steady. "You're strong," he said softly. "And you've done well to protect your family. But this is only the beginning." Just then, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. Alicia's heart skipped a beat, and Daniel's hand instinctively went to his gun. The stranger's eyes narrowed as he moved quickly to the window, peering out at the winding road that led to the house. A black SUV appeared, creeping slowly up the path, its headlights piercing the early morning fog. Alicia's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the vehicle from the night before, the ominous black SUV that had shown up outside the officer's house. The stranger's jaw tightened, and he moved away from the window, his movements quick and calculated. "They found us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Daniel straightened his expression, hardening. "We're not going down without a fight." The stranger nodded, his face a mask of determination. He pulled a handgun from his jacket and checked the clip before handing it to Alicia. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly but her grip steady. She hadn't fired a gun before, but the weight of it in her hand felt strangely reassuring. "Stay low and keep quiet," the stranger instructed. "We'll have to move fast and stay sharp." The sound of footsteps echoed outside the door, followed by a low murmur of voices. Alicia held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she tightened her grip on the gun. Julia clung to her side, her small body shaking with fear. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence as the door was kicked open, splintering under the force. 3 men in dark suits stormed into the room, their faces set in cold determination. They spread out, moving with precision, their eyes scanning the room without hesitation. Daniel fired a shot, the gun's sharp crack echoing through the room. One of the intruders stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, but the others remained unfazed, their expressions hardening as they advanced. The stranger moved with lightning speed, his gun raised as he took down one of the intruders with a single, well-aimed shot. The remaining man lunged toward Alicia, his hand reaching for her gun. She reacted instinctively, pulling the trigger and sending him sprawling to the ground. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the scent of gunpowder and adrenaline. Alicia's hands were shaking, her heart racing as she looked down at the fallen intruder, the reality of what she'd done sinking in. The stranger stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a calm, calculating expression. "This won't be the last of them," he said quietly. "They'll keep coming." Daniel nodded, his face set with grim determination. "Then we'll be ready." They quickly gathered their belongings, knowing they couldn't stay in the house any longer. The SUV outside was still running, and the stranger motioned for them to get in. Alicia hesitated, glancing back at the house one last time before climbing into the vehicle with Julia in her arms. As they sped down the winding road, the sun rising on the horizon, Alicia felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They'd survived this encounter, but she knew their fight was far from over. If you liked this story, share your thoughts and observations in the comments section below, and make sure to like and subscribe for the next interesting and entertaining story ever. Also, to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. Have a nice day.